Listen to me for a moment truly, not as background noise, not like another video, for this is not a conversation, it is a boundary. What if everything you have learned about God is not wrong but incomplete? What if God is not a being that stands above you? Not a judge, not an old man, not a distant principle, but the consciousness that is looking through your eyes right now? What if consciousness did not emerge, but is the source from which space, time, and matter arise? And what if that is precisely why so much in your life sometimes feels wrong, even when everything outwardly seems right? Ask yourself this one question honestly, without evasion. If everything is consciousness, what are you then? A body, a name, a thought, or something that merely experiences all of this? Write it now in the comments. Not what sounds spiritually appealing, not what you have heard somewhere. What do you truly believe? Are you separate from God or an expression of Him? You were not born with the feeling of being separate. As a child, there was no clear I against the world. There was perception, there was wonder, there was life experiencing itself without commentary. Only later did separation come quietly, systematically, so naturally that you never questioned it. At some point you were given your name, not as a label but as a boundary. This is you. And suddenly there was a point where there had only been space. With the name came the role. With the role came the story. With the story came the feeling of being inside and everything else being outside. But pause for a moment and be honest with yourself. Have you ever truly seen this boundary? Or have you merely learned it? You learned to perceive yourself as a body, as something with a beginning and an end, as an object in a world of objects. And because everyone around you played the same game, you never asked whether this game is even real. The illusion of separation does not begin in the body, it begins in language. Language dissects the world. It divides what is undivided in direct experience. I here, you there, inside and outside, subject and object. Yet before you speak of yourself, you are already there. Before you think I, you perceive. The I is not an origin, it is a commentary. Observe yourself for a moment, not your thoughts, but the space in which they appear, not your body, but the perception that feels it. Where does it end? Show me the point where you stop and the world begins. You will not find it, not because it is hidden, but because it never existed. Separation is not a fact, it is a mental construct, a tool useful for orientation, but deadly if taken for truth. And it is here that the misunderstanding of God begins. For as soon as you perceive yourself as a separate being, God must be something separate, something higher, something outside, something that observes, directs, judges. But what if this notion did not arise from truth, but from the illusion of separation? Almost all ancient cultures tell the same story, not in the same words, but with the same structure. In the beginning was unity, no human, no God, no cosmos, only being. The Sumerians, the Vedic texts, Hermeticism, the early Christian mystics, even shamanic primordial cultures, they do not speak of a creator who stands outside, but of a one that experiences itself. Only later, with power structures, with institutions, with fear, did unity become a heaven in consciousness and authority. The question is not whether this unity was real. The question is, why have we forgotten it? Because a separated human is controllable. Because a person who experiences themselves as an isolated self seeks security, seeks rules, seeks salvation, seeks something that will make them whole again. But what if you were never broken? What if the feeling of lack does not stem from a flaw, but from a false assumption about yourself? You have learned to say, I have a consciousness, but no one has asked you whether that is even true. Do you have a consciousness or are you consciousness? The body changes, thoughts come and go, feelings arise and fade, memories blur, yet something remains constant. Something perceives all of this without itself aging. This something is not personal. It carries no name. It has no opinion. And precisely for this reason it is overlooked. For the ego thrives on distinction, on comparison, on identity. It says, I am this person with this story, with these boundaries. But consciousness says nothing. It simply is, and here it becomes uncomfortable. For if consciousness is not personal, then to whom does it belong? To you, or are you merely a temporary perspective within it? The illusion of separation makes you feel like a guest in the universe, a coincidence, a small being in a vast indifferent world. Yet almost all deep, mystical experiences report the opposite. It is not that I am in the universe, but that the universe appears within me. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct description of experience, beyond thought. And perhaps you already sense why this realization is dangerous, not because it is false, but because it changes everything. If separation is an illusion, then guilt must be reconsidered. Fear, competition, death. Then you are not in the world. The world is in what you are. And no, that does not make you special. It makes you honest. For the same source that perceives through you also looks through every other person, through every animal, through every form. Differences exist, but not where we suspect them. Separation is functional, but not fundamental. It aids survival, but hinders realization. And precisely for this reason, awakening does not begin with new information, but with unlearning old assumptions. This chapter was not about giving you something, but about taking something away. The unconscious assumption that you are separate, if you allow it, even for a moment, opens up a completely different question when there is no real separation. What is then more original than everything you know? That is where we will pick up in the next chapter. Almost everything you have learned about the world begins with an assumption. Matter is real. Consciousness arises from it. Brain first, mind later. This assumption seems logical. It is practical. It has produced technology. But it is no longer as certain as you have been taught. For the deeper modern physics looks, the less solid the world becomes. What we call everyday life is an illusion of scale. On a macroscopic level, matter appears stable, tangible, and unequivocal. Yet, as soon as one looks deeper, this certainty vanishes. Atoms, the building blocks of everything, are over 99% empty space. Particles are not tiny spheres, they are probabilities. They do not exist in one location but as mathematical possibilities, and it is here that the problem begins. If matter is not solid, if it only decides its state at the moment of measurement, then it is not a foundation, it is an expression. Modern physics describes not a world of things, but a world of fields, relationships, and information. Particles appear and disappear. Energy fluctuates from nothingness. The so-called vacuum is not empty space, but a bubbling field full of activity. And now comes the question that hardly anyone dares to voice. What perceives this world at all? For every measurement, every experiment, every observation presupposes something that observes. The observer effect is not an esoteric concept. It has been experimentally confirmed. In quantum experiments, it repeatedly shows that as long as no one is looking, the system remains open. Only through observation does the state decide. This does not mean that your ego controls particles, but it does mean that consciousness is not excluded. Classical physics sought to explain the world without an observer. Modern physics can no longer do that, for without observation there is no solid reality, only possibilities. And possibilities are not things, they are information. The question thus shifts radically. If matter arises from information, and information only gains meaning through perception, what is then more fundamental? The answer is uncomfortable. It is not matter that generates consciousness. Consciousness enables matter. Many modern models no longer speak of particles, but of informational structures, of fields, of codes. Yet information without perception is meaningless. A book without a reader is merely paper. A code without execution is only potential. So, who or what reads the universe? Here, physics and philosophy collide at the same boundary. The brain cannot explain consciousness, it can only show correlations. Neuronal activity is found when thoughts arise, but no location is found where consciousness originates. It is as if you were searching for the singer on the radio. The radio does not produce the music, it receives it. The brain is not a producer. It is an interface, a translator between a deeper level and the world of experience. And this is precisely why people in near-death experiences consistently report the same thing. When the brain fails, consciousness does not disappear, it becomes clearer. When matter falls away, perception remains. This contradicts everything we are accustomed to believing, but it fits perfectly with another model. Consciousness is not a byproduct of the world. The world is a byproduct of consciousness, not as a thought, not as a fantasy, but as a structural foundation. Do not imagine consciousness as something personal, not as your consciousness. Imagine it as a field, boundless, timeless, formless, like an ocean in which waves form. The wave believes it is separate. It has a shape, a duration, a movement. Yet it is entirely composed of the ocean. Matter is the wave. Consciousness is the water, and now it becomes clear why space and time cannot be fundamental. Space is an order of relationships. Time is a sequence of states. Both presuppose change and thus perception. Without consciousness, there is no before and after. Without consciousness, there is no position. Without consciousness, there is no here. Space and time are coordinates within experience, not its origin. This also explains why physical theories reach a point where space and time blur, why they collapse in extreme realms, because they are not the foundation but tools. If consciousness is more fundamental than matter, then God is not a being in space. Then God is not an object. Then God is that from which space arises. And here, the entire worldview tips. For if consciousness is the basis, then you are not a random product of a dead universe. You are a local expression of an infinite field that experiences itself, limited, focused, personalized. Not to elevate you, but to enable experience. You are not someone who has consciousness. You are a perspective through which consciousness looks. This is not a spiritual platitude. This is the logical consequence of modern understanding, and perhaps you now sense why this idea has been suppressed for so long. For a person who knows that consciousness is fundamental, no longer harbors existential fear of death. They are not easily manipulated. They do not define themselves by possession, status, or ideology. They no longer ask, "What do I get?" but rather, "What expresses itself through me here?" In the next chapter, we will delve even deeper, for this idea is not new. It was not invented by physicists. It was remembered and repeatedly hidden. And it is precisely there that the next key awaits. If consciousness is more fundamental than matter, then this idea is not new. It is older than any modern theory, older than any church, even older than the word God itself. The ancient texts do not speak of a God out there. They speak of a source that underlies everything, and of a human who has forgotten this source. Yet something crucial happened throughout history. The original experience was translated into dogma. Direct insight became symbols, and inner knowledge was transformed into outer authority. Mystical traditions were never religions in the contemporary sense. They were paths of experience, not belief systems, but states of consciousness. And that is precisely why they were dangerous. For those who recognize that the divine is not separate, need no mediator, no priest, no system that tells them who they are and what they are worth. The Upanishads speak openly of this. The deepest self of a human is identical with the highest reality. Not similar, not near. Identical, tatvam asi. This is not you as ego, not as person, but as that which exists before any identity. Even in Buddhism, it is never about a god in the classical sense. It is about the end of the illusion of a separate self, about seeing through the I that believes itself to be real. Awakening here does not mean becoming something new, but recognizing that there has never been a separate being. At its core, it is about the same realization. What you take for yourself is a construction, and behind this construction lies something timeless, boundless, formless. The Hermetic teachings also state it clearly when read without dilution. Everything is spirit. The universe is mental, not in the sense of being imagined, but in the sense of being consciously permeated. Yet perhaps most explosive is what is written in the early Christian texts, especially in those that were later discarded, reinterpreted, or forbidden. There, Jesus is not presented as an exclusive God, but as someone who is remembered. He does not say, "I am different from you." He essentially says, "I know who I am and you can know it too. The kingdom of God is within you, not in heaven, not after death, not through obedience, but within you." Now the scandal lies not in the sentence itself, but in its consequence. For if the kingdom of God is not separate, then God is not an object of worship, but the foundation of one's own existence. And it is precisely here that this one sentence emerges, which is regarded as a key in almost all traditions, and simultaneously as a danger. I am is not a name, not a description, not an attribute. I am is not a statement about identity. It is a pointer. In mysticism, I am is not an ego statement, but the ultimate reduction of experience. Everything you can say about yourself is already a layer above that. Name, history, role, body, thought. But before all that appears, there is simply being. I am does not refer to someone, but to existence itself. And that is precisely why this sentence was later softened, theologically domesticated, packed into rituals controlled by power structures. For when people realize that I am is not a privilege, but the common origin of all experience, then every artificial hierarchy crumbles. There is no closer to God and further away, no chosen one, no excluded. Then the divine is not something to be attained, but something that can no longer be overlooked. That is why many of these teachings were reinterpreted. From direct experience, faith emerged. From inner authority, external law was born, not because the teachings were wrong, but because they were too true, too liberating, too destabilizing for systems based on fear, guilt, and dependency. And yet, they keep resurfacing in all cultures, at all times, not as copies, but as reminders. For truth cannot be definitively erased, it can only be obscured. And perhaps that is precisely why you feel drawn to these themes. Not because you want to learn something new, but because something within you resonates, as if you were recognizing something you never consciously knew, but always were. The ancient texts never wanted you to believe something. They wanted you to look, not outward, not upward, but inward to where no images remain. And it is here that mysticism and modern insight converge. Not in dogmas, not in explanations, but in the direct experience of consciousness, without names, without form, without boundaries. In the next chapter, we will arrive at a point where this experience is not sought, but overtakes people when the self disappears, when time ceases, when the body is no longer the center. And it is precisely then that it becomes clear whether all of this is merely theory or something that reaches deeper than any concept. There is a moment when no theory holds, no belief, no philosophy, no spiritual practice. A moment when the body fails, and yet something remains. Near-death experiences are among the most documented, yet least understood phenomena of our time. Not because they are rare, but because their consequences shatter our worldview. People from all cultures, age groups, and faiths report experiences that are remarkably similar in structure, regardless of whether they were religious or not. regardless of whether they believed in God or rejected Him. And that is precisely what makes these accounts so uncomfortable, for they do not speak of a personal God who judges, rewards, or punishes. They tell of something much more fundamental. Many first report the loss of the body, not as pain but as relief, as if a heavy shell were falling away. Then the sense of place disappears, of above and below, of inside and outside. Time ceases to be linear. There is no before and after. Everything exists simultaneously or not at all, and then something decisive happens. The self as one knows it dissolves, not as death but as realization. People do not say, "I was gone." They say, "I was more," not as a person, not as a role, but as pure experience. Many report that they no longer felt like someone, but as consciousness itself, boundless, still, all-encompassing. They describe a oneness that is not emotionally overwhelming, but completely self-evident, as if they had remembered. And here it becomes explosive. These experiences often occur when the brain is measurably barely or not at all active, when oxygen is lacking, when electrical activity collapses, when the physical system fails. According to classical understanding, consciousness should vanish here. Yet instead, people report clarity, heightened perception, a consciousness that seems to exist independently of the body. Not as fantasy, not as dream, but as a structured, coherent experience. And again, the same motif emerges. The life review, not as a moral judgment, but as direct experience. People feel what they made others feel, not out of guilt, but out of understanding, as if their own consciousness suddenly was no longer isolated, but connected with everything. Here there is no judgment, no punishment, no reward, only realization. And that precisely contradicts the religious narrative that many know. For these experiences do not speak of separation, they speak of unity. They do not say you were here, God was there, but rather there was no there. Many report that they did not perceive themselves as individuals, but as part of a comprehensive field of consciousness in which everything was contained. The past, the present, other lives, other perspectives. And yet a kind of focus remained, a perspective not as ego but as viewpoint, as if consciousness were observing itself from a particular direction. This is crucial, for it means identity disappears, but consciousness does not. The death of the ego is not the end, it is the end of the illusion, and that is precisely why many people report radically changed priorities after a near-death experience. The fear of death vanishes, material status loses significance, power, control, competition suddenly seem empty, not because they have learned something new, but because they have seen something deeper than any idea. They often express the same sentiment in different words. What I truly am cannot die, not as belief, but as certainty. And here an uncomfortable question arises. If the ego dies, if time disappears, if the body no longer matters, what remains? The accounts are remarkably consistent. Consciousness without boundary, without form, without separation, not as someone, but as everything. This is not proof in the scientific sense, but it is a strong indication. For why would millions of people independently, regardless of culture, education, and belief, describe the same structure? Why do even self-convinced materialists report after such experiences something that completely shatters their worldview? Perhaps because these experiences do not arise from interpretation, but from direct contact with something primordial, not with a God as a person, but with the very source of perception itself. Nature experiences do not reveal what happens after death. They show what remains when everything falls away, when there is no body, no name, no story, and what remains feels more real to those affected than anything they have ever experienced before, more real than life itself. That is the true scandal. For if consciousness can exist without a body, if identity is not bound to matter, then what we call the self is not the center. The ego becomes merely a function, a tool, a filter, useful but not fundamental. And it is precisely here that the circle closes back to the previous chapters. If separation is an illusion, if consciousness is more fundamental than matter, if ancient teachings speak of a source that experiences itself, then near-death experiences are not exceptions. They are glimpses, moments when the filter briefly suspends, revealing what is always there. The question is not whether these experiences are real. The question is, what does it say about the nature of reality when they consistently reveal the same truth? Perhaps death is not the opposite of life. Perhaps it is the end of a perspective, and maybe what we call God is not the destination at the end of the path, but the space in which the path is even possible. In the next chapter, the crucial question will arise right here. If everything is an expression of the same source, what does that mean for our lives? Does this realization liberate us, or is it a new illusion? That is where the final confrontation awaits. At this point in the journey, resistance inevitably arises, not because something is unclear, but because something becomes too clear. The idea that everything is an expression of the same source sounds liberating, and that is precisely why it instills fear, for it takes away the ego's last secure hold. As long as God is something outside of you, you can behave like an observer. You can ask, hope, wait, obey. You can relinquish responsibility. But when everything is consciousness, when there is no real separation, then that distance disappears. Then there is no one left to blame, not fate, not the system, not God. And it is precisely here that freedom separates from delusion. Many people hear the phrase, "Everything is God," and immediately misunderstand it. They turn it into a new identity. I am God, not as realization, but as elevation. Yet this is not awakening. This is the ego in spiritual disguise. For the ego loves nothing more than to place itself at the center, even in the name of unity. True realization does not make one greater, it makes one more permeable. If everything is God, then you are no more than others. You are less separate, not elevated, but embedded. And that is precisely why this realization is not a free pass, but a demand. For if everything is an expression of the same source, then every action is relevant, then suffering is not foreign, then exploitation is not an abstract problem, then violence is not something others do. Everything touches everything. And the ego feels this consequence. It knows that this truth cannot be used without being exposed. That is why it generates fear. Fear of losing control, fear of insignificance, fear that one's own story is not the center of the universe. Yet here lies the paradoxical turning point. Only when the ego recognizes that it is not the center can true freedom emerge. For freedom does not mean being able to do whatever one wants. Freedom means no longer having to act out of fear. When you no longer perceive yourself as an isolated self, you do not need to defend yourself constantly, do not need to compare yourself incessantly, do not need to justify yourself perpetually. You do not have to win in order to exist, and that is precisely why unity is not comfortable. It is radically honest, it allows no victimhood, but it also demands no perfectionism, for unity does not mean that you will become flawless. It means that you take responsibility without self-hatred. Many fear that this perspective promotes an escape from reality, that people withdraw from the world and say, everything is one, so nothing matters. Yet the opposite is true. Those who truly recognize unity cannot remain indifferent, not out of moral obligation, but out of clarity. For when you realize that your inner state colors the world you engage with, mindfulness becomes not a duty, but a natural consequence. Not because you want to be good, but because unmindfulness no longer feels coherent. And here it becomes clear why this realization has often been distorted. For a society of people who no longer primarily define themselves through fear, lack, and comparison is difficult to control. It requires less distraction, less substitute gratification, less external authority. That is why unity is either romanticized or ridiculed as naive spirituality, as an esoteric dream, as a dangerous delusion. Yet true unity is sober, quiet, unremarkable. It does not manifest in grand words, but in subtle decisions: how you listen, how you react, how you handle power, how you deal with fear, not perfectly, but consciously. The crucial question is therefore not, "Am I God?" Yet true unity is sober, quiet, unremarkable. It does not manifest in grand words, but in subtle decisions: how you listen, how you react, how you handle power, how you deal with fear, not perfectly, but consciously. The crucial question is therefore not, "Am I God?" but rather, "How do I live when I am not separate?" Do you then live more recklessly or more attentively? Do you live more selfishly or more honestly? Do you live more out of touch with the world or more present? Unity is not a concept to be acquired. It is a state that reveals itself when the constant defense of the self subsides, and that is precisely why it cannot be forced. It can only be allowed by beginning to question one's own motives, not with guilt, but with curiosity. Why do I react so strongly here? Why do I need approval? Why does losing control frighten me? These questions are not weaknesses, they are gateways. For every time the ego is allowed to relax, something that was previously covered becomes visible, not something mystical, but something simple. Presence, perception, being. And perhaps that is the greatest disappointment and simultaneously the greatest liberation, that God is not a distant goal, not a state for the chosen few. It is not a title to be attained, but the space in which everything appears right now. Not spectacular, not loud, not perfect, but real. And that is precisely why the final decision is not an intellectual one. It is existential. You can dismiss this perspective as an illusion and return to the old model, separated, secure, explainable. Or you can choose not to believe it, but to test it in your daily life, in your relationships, in your reactions. Not to prove something, but to see what happens when you do not act out of separation for a moment. Perhaps this is precisely the point where freedom begins. Not as a concept, not as an identity, but as a quiet shift from the question, "What do I gain?" to "What happens through me?" And if you allow this question to settle within you, honestly and without drama, then perhaps you have already grasped what it is truly about. If you have stayed with me this far, it is not by chance. Something within you has listened, not with the mind, but with the heart. Perhaps it was a gentle remembering, perhaps just a feeling of calm, perhaps the intuition that you are not merely consuming here, but participating. You need not believe anything of what you have heard. You need not adopt anything. It is enough if you take away one thing. You are not alone. You never were. Beyond opinions, beyond roles, beyond fear, there is something that connects us. Quiet, clear, loving, not as an idea, but as an experience. When consciousness experiences itself, it does so not only through words, but through encounters, through listening, through empathy, through people who are willing to truly see one another. This is exactly what this community is. Not a channel, not an algorithm, but a space where consciousness remembers itself. If these words resonate with you, then stay here. Not for me, but for us. Follow this channel, subscribe to it, share it with those who may be quietly searching for answers, yet do not yet know what they seek. Write your thoughts in the comments. Not perfectly, not cleverly, but honestly, for every voice here is part of the same field. Every question a sign of courage. Every insight a step closer to one another. We are not building a stage here. We are building connection, consciously, slowly, authentically. And perhaps awakening is just that, not to rise higher, but to love deeper. spirit to spirit, your zeitgeist.